So now we're up to the Franks, and the Franks were an interesting group of guys. They're more than just Charlemagne, but he is probably the most well-known dude out of all of them. So with the Roman Empire falling over time, and the Franks sometimes playing a part in that, sometimes helping the Roman Empire, and sometimes attacking it, the Germanic tribes took over a lot of the stuff that was going on. Roads and bridges declined, and all this. Basically, this is why it's called the Dark Ages. Things started going downhill. And all these different invasions of different groups. Up here we got the Franks who we're talking about, but yes, there's lots of different groups. The Vandals, the Huns, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, all those groups attacking Rome, and bit by bit until finally it dies. Now the Franks were a Germanic people. They developed a civilization in modern-day France and Germany. Again, that's the region we're going to be talking about quite a bit here. They became farmers and settled down instead of fighting all the time. And eventually the Franks were united under the rule of a guy named Clovis. Now Clovis, he became king at the age of 15. And he was the first Germanic king to convert to Christianity. And we watched that in the video today, this idea of how he wanted to win a battle and he was having a rough time of it. And then he prayed to the Christian God who his wife worshipped, and suddenly he won the battle. And that's what tended to happen, that pagans, when they saw something miraculous and they prayed to the Christian God, then they went ahead and converted frequently. So this is how it started. Again, if you look up here, you can see that the orange area here, that's the Franks to begin with, and then the conquest of Clovis, this area here, bit by bit, a little bit more, and then I know it's hard to see, but by the end of it, Charlemagne's time period, we have all this whole area. When he converted to Christianity, the Romans in his kingdom supported him even more because basically they liked having a Christian king because Rome at that point was pretty much Christianized. He set up a capital in Paris, and he ruled over modern-day France and West Germany. And what his family started what was called the Merovingian dynasty. But when he died, there was fighting about who should take over. And he did something that the Frankish kings did regularly, which was sort of a foolish thing to do on some level. Went ahead and divided his kingdom amongst his 4 sons. And there are those names of those 4 sons right there. And they started fighting amongst each other. That becomes a big problem because the king starts losing power on some level because the nobles become more and more powerful than the king because the king is losing power and the nobles are gaining it. This is really feudalism before it was consolidated by the monarchies that became later. Gradually, a guy named the mayor of the palace became more powerful than the kings. One guy whose nickname was his name was Charles, but his nickname was the Hammer. Was the strongest of the people who served as these mayors of the palace. And he was able to unite the nobles and the church under his rule. He led the Franks to defeat an invading Muslim force in North Africa and stop the expansion of Islam. And this was a hugely important battle in 732 because the Muslims had been coming up through Spain from North Africa, and this stops them from continuing to expand. Obviously, the history of Europe would be substantially different if that had not happened. When Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, also known as, died, his son Pepin became the mayor of the palace. And yes, they had some interesting names back then, Pepin the Short. And he was able to become king because basically the king was so weak. The Pope anointed him, which indicated that the church approved of him, and Pepin helped to protect the church. When a group called the Lombards threatened the Pope had a lot of land that eventually became the Papal States in Italy. Pepin defeated them and gave most of their land in Italy for the Pope to rule. Now Charlemagne, in the early years, one of his sons was named one of Pepin's sons was named Charles, one was Carloman, and Charlemagne means Charles the Great. And the Pope declared that the Franks were never to elect a king was not from the line of Pepin. So that's pretty cool. If you're from the line of Pepin, at least you got a shot. After Pepin died, his kingdom was divided, but Carloman died pretty early on, so Charlemagne got his land too. Charles wanted to control all of Western Europe and make the people Christian, so he fought bunches of wars, took over lots of different areas. And the first group that he fights against is the Lombards. And again, the Lombards were a group that he was not particularly fond of, or at least his dad was not. And Charlemagne, this is kind of hard to explain, but I'll try. Charlemagne signed a treaty with a Lombard duke, and then married the daughter of a Lombard king. And this was partially because he wanted to go ahead and make sure that Carloman couldn't ally with the Lombards, because the Lombards were allied with him. And if they were with him, then they wouldn't be with Carloman. And less than a year after, Charlemagne had his marriage annulled, which means basically not valid anymore. So it's not really a divorce, but it's not valid anymore. He quickly married a Frankish 13-year-old, yes, that's right, a 13-year-old, named Hildegard. Charlemagne's first wife goes back to her father and complains, and you can kind of understand that. And the Lombard king is now mad at Charlemagne, and Carloman, Charlemagne's brother, had died, so that's part of the reason why Charlemagne probably got away with it. And this was the Iron King of the Lombards that is shown there. And the Lombards had a complicated land dispute with the Pope, and Pope Hadrian asked Charlemagne for help, and the Pope always seemed to have a willing ally in the Franks during this time period. Charlemagne defeats the Lombards and becomes their king as well. So after that, he goes and he attacks into Germany and northern Europe, and that's the Saxon area. And he expands his empire further by defeating the Saxons in a series of wars. One of their main goals is to force the conversion of the Saxons to Roman Catholicism. What they're doing in this image right here is they're chopping down a lot of the groups were Druids who worshiped trees and nature, and this was their sacred tree that's being chopped down by Charlemagne's forces. And obviously the people are pretty sad about that, but it's pretty clear if you can destroy their god, then your god is stronger. I guess that's what they were trying to prove. He also looked to expand Christianity into Spain by helping out some Muslim leaders who were basically against another set of Muslim leaders. Things didn't go well, and there's a big retreat over the Pyrenees Mountains, and the rear guard and the baggage train was attacked and destroyed. And this is the famous Song of Roland, which is a very famous poem, and it's retelling the story. The story is very inaccurate. It basically tells about how Roland was this guy who went ahead and tried to defeat the Muslim group who was attacking them, the Saracens, and he dies a horribly valiant death where he blows out his eardrums with his horn. Charlemagne worked really closely with the church, and he wanted a united Christian kingdom, Western Europe, since he was the ruler of what became the Western Roman Empire. The Pope crowned him the new Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Emperor. And this is actually his throne, which is not exactly the fanciest thing, but Charlemagne sets up courts. He counts where to help Charlemagne by taking care of local problems and protecting weak people. He had a meeting of all his leaders and warriors to talk about new laws, but he was the guy who made the final decisions. He ruled from a place called Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen, and he moved around it a lot to keep track of his officials, make sure there were no shenanigans going on. He believed it was important to be educated, and education for his people was also important. He worked to start making more schools in the church. Under Charlemagne, some of the arts started to recover from Rome, from the Roman fall. So there was some artwork and painting and stuff like that. Still, most people were not able to read and write. This was rare for people to be able to read and write. That's how it looked back then. Because again, books were not cheap. They were very expensive because you had to copy them by hand. Most of the people, well, the lords, they were the people who owned estates, and they lived in nicer houses. The estates made lots of materials. The lords lived in stone farmhouses with stockades. The farmers lived in these sort of small wooden houses with wattle and daub construction, which is basically mud and plaster. And then the thatched roof. And they worked on the land of the Lord, and owned a small piece of the land that the Lord had given them. And this is a move towards eventually serfdom. The poor had lots of work to do. They rotated the crops so the soil remained fertile, because you don't want to grow the same thing in the same soil every year. Farmers had a lot had to do a lot of service for the lords, and eventually, as I said, became serfs, where people were stuck on the land and couldn't move without their permission. But there's a group called minstrels, who were these traveling singers who sang about how great Charlemagne was. But Charlemagne makes the classic Frankish mistake. After his death, his weak son Louis the Pious, well, it's Louis the Pious who's the problem, really. His kingdom started to fall apart, and he weakened the kingdom further because he divided it amongst his three sons, and then those three sons fight each other. And they divided up into countries that became France and Germany. And that's it.